Good evening, dear listener. If you found yourself here tonight, perhaps you've been searching for a quiet story, one with no rush, no urgency, no great moral lesson waiting at the end. Just the slow drift of history, soft as candle smoke in a wooden room. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. Let the noise of the day fall away, the clatter of thoughts, the errands unfinished, the clock ticking somewhere nearby. Now, if you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these quiet evenings alive. And when this story's over, I'd love to read your comment below. Tell me where you're listening from. Perhaps in bed, a cup of tea by your side. Or maybe in the hush of a night shift, somewhere far away. Tonight, we travel back, not to castles or kings, but to the low-roofed taverns of early medieval Europe. A world of wood and fire, of ale and honey, of laughter and quiet murmurs beneath beams darkened by centuries of smoke. Before the church bells of dawn, before the cold air swept through the valley, there was the nightly ritual. A simple drink before sleep. They called it the cup of honey. Sometimes mead, sometimes warm milk stirred with sweetness, sometimes a blend of herbs steeped in old clay mugs. But to the people of those times, peasants, monks, travelers, and weary blacksmiths, it was more than a drink. It was a pause between the labors of the day and the darkness of night. Imagine a tavern at the edge of a small settlement around the 9th century. The walls built of rough timber, gaps filled with moss and mud. A single doorway hung with thick hides to keep the wind out. Inside, a narrow hall lined with benches. The smell of wood smoke and tallow candles thick in the air. A dog sleeping by the hearth. A serving woman carrying clay cups, her apron darkened with ale stains. The men speak in low voices, not from secrecy but from tiredness. Their speech is the soft rhythm of familiarity. Each word rolls like a pebble down a stream, steady, unhurried, touched by dialects lost to time. On the table, bowls of coarse bread, bits of cheese, a pot of something sweet, honey diluted with warm water. It's not quite mead yet. Fermentation takes time, and time is a luxury. But for tonight, this simple sweetness will do. One of the men dips his cup into the pot, raises it to his lips, and sighs. The taste of honey lingers, golden, floral, a memory of summer fields, even as frost gathers outside the door. The tavern is small, but it hums like a hive. Every person there carries the echo of the day, the ache of plowing, the soot of the forge, the sting of cold wind against skin. Yet here, under flickering light, all that weight seems to soften. You can almost hear the murmurs. Tomorrow the river might freeze. The Lord's men rode past the fields again. Did you hear about the peddler's daughter? Idle talk, faint and drifting, like smoke caught in beams. And then, the ritual begins. Before the night ends, before the last candle fades, someone pours the final cup. The night cup, as they called it. Honey mixed with herbs. Maybe thyme, maybe mint. Maybe something bitter to soothe the stomach after a heavy meal. To drink before sleep was not just indulgence. It was a kind of prayer. The body needed warmth, the soul, a small sweetness to guard it through the long dark. For in early medieval nights, the dark was not an empty silence. It was alive with creaks, sighs, the distant bark of wolves, the crackle of frost, and the whispered prayers of those who feared dreams. The tavern keeper, usually a woman, would move slowly through the room, checking the cups. She'd refill what was empty, add a bit of honey if the mood felt too quiet, and sometimes hum an old tune, one that her mother had sung before her. the kind of tune that needs no words, because the melody itself feels like home. And in this slow rhythm of sound, the hum, the cups clink, the fires sigh, the tavern became more than a place to drink. It became a refuge, the beating heart of small communities that knew how fragile life was and how sacred a shared moment of warmth could be. Outside, the moon hangs low, a pale coin above the roofs. Snow gathers in the corners of the road where oxen have passed earlier. The wind moves through the thatch and shakes loose a fine dust of straw, catching the light like golden rain. But inside, the warmth holds. A child sleeps near the fire, curled in a woolen blanket. Two travelers murmur softly in Latin, speaking of roads and abbeys. A bearded man carves a piece of wood with a knife too dull to cut. Yet he keeps carving, not for shape, but for the comfort of motion. The night deepens. No one seems to notice when conversation fades entirely. Only the sound of a log shifting and the soft drone of wind against the wall. And then, the final ritual. The tavern keeper lifts the last pot of honey water and whispers, almost reverently, "One more for warmth before the dawn." Each cup is filled in turn. Some cross themselves, some murmur thanks, others only raise the cup in silent acknowledgement. They drink slowly, savoring it, not for the flavor, but for the rhythm of it. Sip, sigh, silence. This is how 1,000 evenings ended in the centuries between the fall of Rome and the rise of cathedrals. Not in battle or glory, but in the shared sweetness of honey and the steady breathing of tired souls. So as you listen tonight, imagine yourself seated among them. A wooden bench beneath you, warmth on your hands, a flicker of firelight dancing across the rim of your cup. Outside, the dark presses close, but here you are safe. Here the night is gentle. And in this quiet hour, as you drink your cup of honey before sleep, know that countless others once did the same, centuries ago, dreaming under the same stars that now rest above your own roof. Stay a while, dear listener. In the next chapter, we'll step deeper into these candlelit halls to discover what was drunk, how it was brewed, and the forgotten recipes whispered from monk to merchant. But for now, close your eyes, let the warmth linger, and may your dreams taste faintly of honey. Outside the tavern, dawn is still a rumor. The sky is dark as slate, and frost clings to the window ledge like a thin crust of sugar. Inside, embers glow softly, and the smell of sweet yeast lingers, the invisible memory of last night's drink. Brewing, in the early medieval world, was never simply a craft. It was closer to an act of devotion, a ritual born of patience and trust. For those who lived in that age, where food spoiled quickly and water was often uncertain, the making of drink was as sacred as the making of bread. The drinks of the night were not yet the beers and wines we know today. Instead, they were rustic, alive, breathing concoctions. Each batch a little different, each brewer guided not by written recipes but by touch, taste, and intuition passed down in murmured instruction. The hearth as a brewery. In most small settlements, brewing began not in taverns, but in homes. The hearth was the heart of both, for warmth, for food, and for brewing. Women were the keepers of this art. They stirred great clay pots of barley, rye, or oats, their sleeves rolled to the elbow, arms shining with heat and effort. They knew by scent alone when the mash was ready, when the sweetness of grain turned to the soft sour of fermentation. In the quiet rhythm of daily life, brewing became a kind of domestic alchemy. Imagine a low-roofed cottage with thick smoke, curling from a small hole in the ceiling. A woman kneels near the fire, stirring a wooden paddle through the mixture of crushed grain and water. The room smells earthy, rich, and faintly sweet. A smell that clings to her skin, her hair, her clothes. Children watch sleepily from a straw bed as the pot bubbles and whispers. The liquid is strained through bundles of herbs, sometimes yarrow, sometimes mugwort, sometimes the tender tips of spruce, each chosen for flavor, or for what the healers said would soothe the stomach or calm bad dreams. There was no standard brew, no fixed measure. Each village's ale was different, thick or thin, bitter or mild, strong or weak, and all were alive with the tiny, invisible work of wild yeast drifting through the air. The drink was less filtered, more textured, cloudy, almost like a thin porridge. It was nourishing as much as intoxicating. And so, when evening came and villagers gathered in the tavern, what they drank was not just a product, but a living link to their homes, to their wives, their sisters, their mothers. Every swallow carried the warmth of someone's hearth. Honey in memory, then, there was honey, the oldest sweetness of humankind. In those centuries, honey was both food and medicine, luxury and necessity. It preserved, it healed, and most importantly, it sweetened the bitterness of life. Beekeeping in early medieval Europe was not an idle pastime. Hives were tended with care and reverence, often under the shadow of monasteries. Monks wore veils of linen, and when they opened the hives, they whispered prayers to Saint Gobnate of Ireland or Saint Ambrose, the patron of bees. The honey they gathered was more than a substance. It was light made solid, sunlight trapped in golden threads. It went into everything, into bread, ointments, wine, and above all, the evening drink. When mixed with warm water and left to ferment, honey became mead, the drink of the gods, as the Norse sagas would later call it. But in the early centuries, it was more modest, a household treasure, something to be shared in small cups rather than poured in feasts. To drink mead before bed was to remember the summer, the hum of bees, the scent of clover, the warmth of fields. It was to let sweetness linger on the tongue before surrendering to the dark. In some regions, it was said that honey kept nightmares away. Old folk whispered that the bees carried light from heaven, and to drink of their gift before sleeping meant that angels would watch one's dreams. The taverns of the quiet hours. Not every settlement had a tavern in the modern sense. Often, it was just one house, the largest, the one nearest the crossroads, where people gathered after dusk. A low wooden sign, maybe a carved mug or a bunch of dried herbs, marked the place. Inside, the floor was earthen. The benches creaked. A single candelabrum held stubs of wax candles, guttering in drafts that slipped through the cracks. The tavern keeper was usually a woman, widowed or old enough to have seen several winters pass. Her hands were rough from work, her eyes steady. She brewed her ale in the back room, where barrels sat like silent monks in the half-light. When travelers arrived, pilgrims, traders, or even a messenger from the abbey, they brought stories, and sometimes spices, a pinch of cinnamon, a sprig of rosemary, a flake of dried ginger. These were treasures that turned ordinary drinks into something almost magical. And so, new flavors entered the nightly ritual. Warm milk sweetened with honey and dusted with herbs for sleep. Mulled ale thickened with eggs and stirred with a stick of oak. A draught of spiced wine, faintly sour, served to monks on cold evenings. Each cup was a small comfort against the vast unknown of night. The brewing tools. If one could step into a medieval brewing room, it would feel strangely intimate. The tools were simple: a cauldron, a paddle, a ladle, a few clay jars, some cloth for straining. But every item bore the marks of countless nights. Scratches from stirring, black soot from the fire, honey crusted in corners. The cauldron was heavy iron, handed down through generations. It rarely left the hearth. Even when not in use, it sat there, as if waiting. Nearby, a stone slab for grinding herbs. Bundles of plants hung from the rafters: sage, fennel, wormwood, mint, and valerian root. They swayed gently in the smoke like ghostly bells. And on a small shelf, a collection of cups, no two the same. Wooden mugs carved by hand, pottery glazed unevenly, some cracked, but still used. Each cup told a story. Some bore initials, some a mark of a cross, others a crude animal. In this world, objects aged with dignity, repaired, reused, and remembered. To the medieval brewer, brewing was not science, it was rhythm. The slow art of listening. The bubbling of the mash told its own story. Its scent revealed its mood. They would bend their ear to the pot, as though the brew itself were whispering when it was ready. The sounds of brewing. If you close your eyes now, you might hear it. The soft glup-glup of fermenting grain, the rhythmic scrape of a wooden paddle, the hiss of boiling liquid. And beneath it all, the low hum of a song, the kind that keeps time better than any clock. Brewing was always accompanied by sound. A brewer's song was said to keep the spirits of the yeast content. In some villages, silence during brewing was bad luck. They believed the mixture would turn sour if not serenaded. So the women sang. Old melodies about the harvest, about rivers and bees, about saints and lost loves. Songs that no one wrote down, because they didn't need to. The tune lived in memory, passed from mother to daughter, like a hidden recipe. Mead and faith monasteries were the great preservers of brewing in the medieval world. Behind stone walls and under tiled roofs, monks perfected what villagers practiced. They brewed in silence, reading scripture between stirring and skimming. To them, drink was both labor and devotion, the transformation of earth's gifts into comfort and sustenance. Mead, in particular, held a spiritual resonance. It was mentioned in psalms, used in rituals, poured in remembrance of saints. Some abbeys believed honey to be symbolic of divine wisdom, sweetness drawn from toil. Thus, mead was not mere indulgence, but a small echo of paradise itself. Visitors to monasteries were often given a warm drink before bed, not as hospitality, but as blessing. To sleep after a cup of honeyed mead was to sleep in peace, the quiet science of sweetness. Even without written knowledge of chemistry, the medieval brewer understood harmony. Too much heat, and the drink turned harsh. Too little, and it soured. They learned by instinct, the same way they learned when bread was ready or when storms were coming. They knew that certain herbs coaxed calm: valerian for dreamless sleep, chamomile for restless minds, hyssop for coughs that woke one at midnight, lemon balm for those whose thoughts turned too often toward sadness. And in every brew there was honey to balance, to bind, to soften. A cup shared in silence. When the brewing was done and night returned, the tavern again filled with quiet. The same faces, the same wooden walls, the same dance of light and shadow. A pot was brought to the table, steaming softly. No one rushed to drink. Instead, they sat a while, feeling the warmth rise from it, the smell of honey and grain mingling with smoke. To drink together was to share the same comfort, the same vulnerability. There was something sacred in that silence, the way people looked into their cups before tasting. Perhaps they thought of the day gone by, or of loved ones far away. Perhaps they prayed, in their own wordless way, that tomorrow would be gentle. And when they finally drank, it was not with laughter, but with sighs. Small sounds of relief, the day's labor melting from their bones. The philosophy of the cup. To us, the act of drinking may seem ordinary, but in the early medieval world, it was layered with meaning. A cup was never just a vessel. It was a reminder of community, of dependence, of the fragile boundary between hunger and plenty, solitude and companionship. The poorest man might own one mug, carved from ash wood, and it was his alone, his possession, his daily companion. He might drink from it by the fire, set it beside his bed at night, carry it on long walks. That cup saw his joy and his sorrow. And when he died, it might even be buried with him. In this way, even a simple act, the nightly drink, bound life together, closing the night. And now, as the fire lowers and the tavern quiets once more, the world outside grows still. The moon watches the roof, and frost begins to bloom again on the windows. The brewer has cleaned her pots and covered them for morning. The tavern keeper sits alone, her hands folded on the table. Before her, a single cup, her own. She drinks slowly, eyes half closed, the taste of honey resting on her tongue. Somewhere beyond the fields, a wolf howls once, faint and far. She listens, but does not fear. The warmth inside is enough. This too is the art of brewing, not merely to make a drink, but to craft a moment of peace between the heart and the night. Pause, faint sound of a cup being set down on wood. And so, as you rest now, think of that slow alchemy. Water, grain, and honey transformed into comfort. The same comfort you might feel now, lying in the soft dark, listening to the hush of another time. May your evening be warm. May your sleep be deep. And may the dreams that come be as gentle as the rise of steam from a honeyed cup. Night in the early medieval tavern was not silent. It was alive with sound. Not the harsh noise of revelry, but the soft weave of human presence. The kind of sound that filled the space without ever breaking the peace. The scrape of wood on wood, the slow shifting of benches, the rustle of woolen sleeves, and the quiet rise of voices that carried more warmth than words. After the last of the honey cups were poured, the rhythm of the evening would change. The day's weight had been lifted. The aches had softened. The talk began to stretch, the smiles to linger. The fire glowed low, orange, deep, breathing gently, and the smoke curled upward through a narrow hole in the roof, twisting like the threads of some forgotten tapestry. Beyond the door, the night pressed close. But here, in this small world of firelight, people gathered as they always had, finding comfort in one another's nearness. The hum of companionship in an age before clocks, before the division of time into minutes and hours, night was measured by mood. There was the hour of arrival, weary, practical, talk of the weather and crops. Then the hour of food, bread torn apart, hands warmed. And then, as the drink mellowed the mind and loosened the tongue, came what the old storytellers called the hour of the hum. Not song, not yet. Just the low, contented murmur of people who had stopped pretending to be alone. At one table, a pair of shepherds murmured about lambing season. At another, two travelers compared the bridges they had crossed. A monk visiting from the abbey scribbled something in his small leather book, pausing now and then to sip and listen. There were no grand speeches, no arguments, no boasting, only the slow unfolding of voices, like the unwinding of thread from a spool. The tavern was the loom, the night, the weaver. Songs of the hearth. Eventually, someone would hum a tune. Perhaps a woman near the fire, her voice low and plain, or a man sharpening his knife, whistling between his teeth. In the medieval world, everyone knew songs. They were as common as tools, and carried from village to village on the tongues of pilgrims, soldiers, and tinkers. There were songs of work, rhythmic, steady to mark the pulling of nets, the threshing of grain, the swinging of hammers. There were songs of loss, soft as candlelight, sung for those who never returned from war or who vanished in winter. And there were songs of comfort, simple, circular melodies that repeated until they felt eternal. Lullabies for grown men, disguised as drinking tunes. Sometimes the words were clear. Sometimes they were only syllables. Nonsense sounds that existed for the pleasure of being sung. If you had been there, sitting on that bench beside the fire, you would have felt the song more than heard it. The way the air changed when people joined in, hesitant at first, then stronger. The way voices layered, imperfectly yet beautifully, like waves rising and falling on the same shore. The songs were not loud. They did not seek applause. They existed the way breathing does, a natural part of being alive together. The instruments of the night. Occasionally, someone would bring an instrument. A small harp, its frame carved from ash wood. A simple flute of bone or reed. Or the soft drum of a stretched hide, beaten with fingers more than sticks. In the dimness, these sounds blended with the creak of wood and the hiss of the fire. There was no stage, no performer. The tavern itself was the instrument, its walls amplifying every note, its rafters resonating with the quiet pulse of rhythm. Music in these nights was never spectacle. It was presence, a reminder that sound could carry emotion where language failed. The melodies wandered. Some were folk airs so old that no one remembered their beginning. Others had come from distant lands, learned by soldiers in Frankish wars or by merchants returning from the Rhine. They mingled freely, for memory cared little for borders. The flutist played with closed eyes, as if remembering a voice long gone. The harpist plucked strings that trembled like candlelight. And the tavern listened, not with silence, but with gentle breaths, nods, and the soft tapping of cups. The gentle games. When the songs faded, another form of companionship would begin. The games. Not the raucous gambling of later centuries, but simple diversions made from what was at hand. A piece of carved bone became a die. A few pebbles marked on a table turned into a board. Hands made gestures, guessing numbers, hiding stones. The games were slow, unhurried. More often, they were excuses for conversation, the talk that filled the spaces between moves. The winner smiled quietly. The loser shrugged. There were no wagers, or if there were, they were small. A sip of ale, a crust of bread, a favor owed. It was the rhythm that mattered, the way time folded itself gently around the act of play. Some games required words instead of objects. A question asked in rhyme, a riddle, a story half told that others had to finish. Each answer brought laughter, not the loud, sudden kind, but the soft chuckle of shared wit. One riddle might have gone like this. I am born of the earth, shaped by the hand, filled with the gift of the field. I am broken to nourish, emptied to please. What am I? And someone, with a grin, would whisper, the cup. The tavern keeper, overhearing, would smile and refill it. The laughter of the hearth, medieval laughter, was not the loud, careless sound of abundance. It was smaller, quieter, more intimate. like the sudden flare of a candle in darkness. In those days, life was hard and joy was fragile. To laugh was to resist despair, to say, for this moment, I am still alive. The laughter in the tavern came easily, but it was never cruel. It rose from small jokes, from the quirks of language, from shared memories of mischief or mistakes. Someone might recall the time a goose wandered into Mass and honked through the priest's sermon. Or when a monk slipped on ice carrying a bucket of ale meant for the abbot. Or when two farmers spent half a day arguing whether a shadow was a sign of rain or a visit from St. Cuthbert. The stories grew with every telling, embroidered with exaggeration, but always ending in the same round of quiet chuckles. Even the serious faces, the travelers, the monks, the elders, could not resist smiling. Laughter in that room had the power to knit strangers together faster than any prayer. Women's voices in the tavern. Though men often filled the benches, the tavern was not solely theirs. Women brewed the drink, served it, and sometimes sat down to share it. Their voices shaped the night as surely as any harp or flute. A serving woman might lean against a post, wiping her hands on her apron, and tell a story, a tale of the forest spirits that danced in mist, or of the beehives that sang to warn of storms. Her voice would soften the edges of the night, and the listeners, weary from the day, would nod as if they'd seen such things themselves. In truth, these tales were not believed in the way faith was believed. They were remembered in the way dreams are remembered, half fading, half real. And that was enough. Sometimes the stories were not of spirits, but of people, long-lost loves, brave sisters, foolish men. A favorite was the tale of the tavern girl who tricked a nobleman by selling him watered mead, then using his own purse to pay for her mother's rent. Each retelling brought new laughter, new sympathy. Storytelling was another kind of drinking, the slow savoring of memory. The rhythm of nightfall. The hours in a tavern had no clock, only cues. When the fire burned low, it was late. When the last log was set, it was later still. When someone yawned, another followed. But the night did not end abruptly. It ebbed slowly, gently, like a tide retreating from the shore. Some fell asleep on benches, heads resting on arms. Others slipped out into the cold, walking home beneath the moon. The sound of boots on frost mixed with the fading echo of a song still lingering in the air. Inside, the tavern keeper moved quietly, gathering cups, stoking the coals for morning. She hummed softly to herself, not out of duty, but habit. The scent of honey, smoke, and sweat mingled, forming that peculiar perfume of old taverns, the smell of humanity preserved in warmth. Dreams of the drunk and the sober sleep came differently to those who drank. Some dreamed vividly of rivers of mead and golden bees. Others slept like stones, blank and deep. But even the sober ones, lying in their narrow beds, felt the echo of the tavern. The rhythm of voices, the trace of laughter, the hum of a half-forgotten melody. It was not drunkenness that lingered, but fellowship, a sense of belonging that followed one into dreams. In that age, when most of life was toil and silence, the tavern offered something rare, a place to be seen, to be heard, to be human. The legacy of songs centuries later, when scholars wrote about those times, they rarely mentioned the taverns. They wrote of wars, of kings, of councils and treaties. But the songs survived, not in parchment, but in people. They passed through generations like the taste of honey in old wood. A fragment here, a verse there, reappearing in later centuries, in new forms, sung to new tunes. yet always carrying the faint echo of firelight and mead. It is said that one of these old melodies became a Christmas carol, another a lullaby, another a harvest hymn sung long after its origin was forgotten. That is the quiet immortality of tavern songs. They slip from history, yet remain in humanity. Closing reflections. Now, as our story folds itself once more into stillness, imagine the tavern after everyone is gone. The door stands slightly open, letting a breath of cold air stir the ashes. The benches are empty, the cups turned upside down. A single candle burns low, its wax dripping like tears of gold. Outside, the world sleeps. Inside, only the whisper of the hearth remains. The same warmth that carried laughter now hums in the silence, gentle as a heartbeat. It waits for morning, for the next day's chores, for new faces, for new stories. And so, the life of the tavern continues, a rhythm of gathering and resting, of song and stillness. As you lie listening now, let that rhythm settle into your breath. The murmur of voices fading, the sigh of fire, the soft tap of a cup on wood. These are the sounds of peace. They belong not to one century or one land, but to every moment where humans have chosen warmth over solitude. And perhaps tonight, your own quiet is part of that same old music, the eternal song of honey, fire, and companionship before sleep. Outside, the night stretched long and cold, but within the tavern, there was warmth, and with it, the steady rhythm of travelers arriving, shaking the frost from their cloaks, stamping their feet, and drawing slow breaths of relief. It was always the same sound. A door creaking open, a gust of cold air curling inward, and then a pause. That first breath when the stranger entered, and the scent of road dust mingled with the smoke of home. The arrival of a stranger. In the early medieval world, travel was a slow and uncertain thing. Roads were little more than rutted paths through forest and field. Bridges creaked with rot. Rivers changed course without warning. And between the small clearings of civilization lay miles of dark silence. To walk such distances was to surrender to the elements, to accept hunger, solitude, and the strange companionship of weather. Yet, there were always wanderers, men in coarse cloaks, women with baskets bound in linen, monks on pilgrimage, merchants with tired mules. Some walked for trade, others for penance, others for reasons they could not name. And when night came, when the sun slipped behind the hills and the air thickened with mist, all of them sought the same thing. A place of light, a roof, a cup of something warm. The tavern stood waiting. Its faint glow through the cracks in the shutters was as good as a beacon. No matter how small or humble, it meant one thing. Humanity still lived here. The traveler would push open the door and pause. Every face would lift, half in curiosity, half in habit. For in a world where news was carried by foot, every stranger was a messenger. Then the nod came, the wordless greeting. A bench was cleared, a pot was brought, and the ritual of belonging began. The pilgrims' cups. Among the travelers, the most respected were the pilgrims. They wore wooden crosses or scallop shells on cords around their necks, symbols of their holy destination. Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago, Canterbury. Their clothes were dusty, their feet bound in rough sandals, their faces thin from fasting and sun. Yet, when they sat by the fire, they carried a quiet dignity. They had seen the world, and the world had marked them. Tavern keepers often gave them drink freely, not for profit, but for blessing. It was said that to serve a pilgrim, was to earn a small indulgence in heaven. And so, a warm cup of honeyed ale was poured without question, even when supplies were short. Pilgrims, in return, told stories, not grand miracles, but small human ones. Of a monastery that baked bread so light, it was said angels had kneaded it. Of a hermit who carved a chapel in a cliff and sang psalms to the wind. Of a woman who carried her husband's bones across France to bury him on sacred ground. Each tale settled into the room like the scent of wax, soft, lingering, illuminating something unspoken in the listeners' hearts. To the peasants, these stories were windows into a larger world. To the weary monks, reminders of faith's endurance. To the lonely, proof that journeys and endings were possible. And when the pilgrim raised his cup, all raised theirs. For in that moment, the tavern became more than a house of drink. The monks on the road. Then there were the monks, travelers of a different kind. Their robes smelled of wool and rain, their hair was tonsured in the crown, and their steps were deliberate, quiet, like prayer in motion. They traveled not for penance, but for duty, to carry letters between abbeys, to bless new churches, to inspect vineyards, to copy texts or teach new novices. Though they were men of silence, they were also men of stories. When a monk sat by the tavern hearth, the room hushed, not from fear, but from respect. He might speak of scripture or of harvests, or of the strange beasts kept in the bishop's menagerie. He might describe the bells of a farm monastery that rang so sweetly they could calm storms, or the vineyards of Aquitaine where the grapes were blessed by the saints of old. But when the cup passed to him, he would drink like any other, slow, thoughtful, and with gratitude. Honeyed ale, he would say, is proof of divine order. For what the bee gathers from flowers, man brews with patience, and God allows to ferment into comfort. The tavern would murmur in agreement, and for a moment, even the most skeptical among them would feel the warmth of faith in their chest. Monks were also skilled listeners. They heard confessions whispered in corners, not the formal kind, but the confessions of the ordinary. A farmer's fear of bad harvests, a widow's grief, a traveler's guilt. No absolution was spoken aloud, only a hand placed gently on the table, a shared silence, a nod. And sometimes, that was enough. The merchants' rest. Not all travelers were pious. Some came for profit, the merchants, the traders, the carriers of news and goods. They wore better cloaks, and their pouches jingled faintly when they moved. They spoke of cities beyond imagining, ports where ships the size of churches floated, markets where silk shone like water, and perfumes sweet enough to make one forget winter entirely. In the firelight, their words painted dreams. A farmer listening might imagine his own village transformed. The fields gold with wheat, the tavern bright with candles, the sound of coins instead of rain. But even the merchant, in the stillness after the telling, reached for the same cup as the poorest shepherd. Gold and faith both dissolved in the warmth of honey and grain. For a brief hour, they were equals, bound by thirst, by fatigue, by the fragile comfort of being alive. The wandering minstrel, and then there was the minstrel, neither holy nor rich, but perhaps the most beloved of all who entered. He carried no relic, no coin, only a small harp and a bag of tales. His clothes were patched and faded, his boots worn thin. But when he began to play, even the monks forgot their discipline. His songs were stitched from everything he had seen, the grief of widows, the laughter of children, the echo of bells across the valley. He sang of kings who fell in love with shepherd girls, of knights who drank too deeply and dreamed of angels, of bees that guarded lost treasures. No two songs were the same, for he changed them with each telling. He added a name here, a village there, until the story seemed to belong to the very people listening. When his song ended, the silence that followed was deep and full. Then came the quiet applause, not clapping, but the slow tapping of cups against the table. He bowed, smiled, and took his drink. For the minstrel knew well that his pay was not coin, but warmth, food, and the sound of his own voice echoing in kind hearts. The shared fire travelers and locals, monks and merchants, men and women, all found their way to the same fire. The tavern was the world in miniature. Here, the distances between lives shrank. The barriers of rank, speech, and creed blurred under the same smoke-stained beams. A peasant might drink beside a scholar, a soldier beside a pilgrim. A nun traveling under escort might rest in the corner, her face turned from the fire, but listening all the same. The warmth was impartial. It wrapped them all in the same soft light. And in that circle, stories were traded like currency. A man gave what he knew, a tale, a warning, a piece of wisdom, and received in return another's memory. The tavern became an unwritten archive, each evening recording its own quiet history. The weight of the road. When the hour grew late and the crowd thinned, only the travelers often remained awake. The locals drifted home, but the road folk lingered, their bodies too restless for sleep, their minds still carrying the rhythm of movement. They sat close to the embers, sometimes silent, sometimes whispering of roads yet to come. A monk might trace a map in spilled ale, the path from Paris to Cologne, from Canterbury to the sea. A pilgrim might pull a small token from his satchel, a smooth stone from the Holy Land, a piece of cloth from a saint's shrine, and show it reverently before tucking it back. And then, the most haunting moment. One by one, they began to drift into sleep, not all at once, but slowly, like leaves settling after wind. The minstrel's harp leaned against the wall. The monk's lips moved in prayer even as he dozed. A merchant's hand rested protectively on his pouch. The fire dimmed to a red glow. Outside, the world turned beneath the stars. Silent, vast, indifferent. But here, within these walls, humanity held its fragile flame. The meaning of the journey travel, in those centuries, was more than movement. It was transformation. Each step taken on the road wore away something. Pride, certainty, the illusion of control, until only the essential self remained. In the tavern, among strangers, a pilgrim might rediscover what he had lost. Kindness, laughter, the courage to face tomorrow. A merchant might find humility, a monk understanding, and a simple villager might, for one night, glimpse the vastness of the world beyond his fields. The road and the tavern were partners. One taught endurance, the other rest. Together, they formed the rhythm of medieval life, effort and pause, exile and homecoming, the blessing of departure. At dawn, when the frost still clung to the eaves, the travelers rose. The tavern keeper was already awake, tending the fire, pouring the last of the ale into wooden cups. One by one, the travelers drank in silence, not to celebrate, but to prepare. Outside, the world was pale with morning. The road stretched endless, uncertain, yet none lingered. Before leaving, each touched the doorframe, a small superstition, a wish for safe passage. The monk murmured a blessing. The minstrel whistled a farewell tune. The pilgrim whispered a prayer for those still asleep. And when they were gone, The tavern felt strangely larger, as though the walls themselves had listened and remembered. The keeper sighed, straightened the benches, and poured herself a small drink of honey water. She raised it toward the door and said softly, "May the road be kind." The warmth from her breath curled upward like incense. Closing reflections. So many feet passed through those doors over the centuries. So many voices shared the same space of light and shadow. Most of their names are forgotten, but the feeling they left behind, that soft communion of travelers in the dark, remains. It lives in every roadside inn, every small place where strangers share warmth and trust for a night. It lives in us. When we meet another soul and, for a moment, drop our guard. For that is what the tavern offered, not just drink, but recognition. A reminder that the journey is easier when it is shared, and that even the loneliest traveler, beneath a roof and beside a fire, becomes part of something enduring. As you lie here now, listening to the quiet, imagine yourself at that doorway, the cold air before you, the road ahead, and behind you, the fading scent of honey and wood smoke. The world is vast, but not empty. Everywhere, someone tends a fire. Everywhere, someone waits with a cup of warmth for the weary. And perhaps, in your dreams tonight, you will travel again. Not through time or distance, but through memory. Toward that simple light in the dark that has always called us home. When the dawn mist lifted above the valleys of early medieval Europe, one could often see a line of smoke rising not from a village hearth, but from a monastery on a hill. There, behind stone walls, under sloping roofs of slate or tile, another kind of tavern quietly thrived. One without noise, without laughter, without coin. A place where brewing became prayer. The abbey as a world of its own monasteries in the early Middle Ages were small worlds contained within larger ones. They rose like islands amid forests, their bells marking the passing of hours more faithfully than any town clock. Within their walls, men lived not for wealth or pleasure, but for order. The sacred rhythm of ora et labora, pray and work. Every sound had purpose. The toll of the bell meant prayer. The scrape of a hoe meant cultivation, and the bubbling of a cauldron in the brewhouse meant transformation. Grain into sustenance, sweetness into comfort, water into purity. For in an age when water could make one ill, and famine often knocked at the gates, the monks became guardians, not only of the soul, but of the stomach. Their drinks, ale, wine, mead, cider, were not luxuries, but necessities of life, brewed with discipline and devotion. The brewhouse at the cloister's edge. The brewhouse was rarely placed at the heart of the monastery. It stood near the outer wall, close to the kitchens, far from the silence of the church. Its walls were blackened by smoke, its floor damp from spilled wort, its air heavy with the scent of malted grain and yeast. But to those who worked there, it was sacred space nonetheless. Imagine a brother at dawn, robe tied, sleeves rolled, breath misting in the cool air, opening the shutters to let the light in. Dust motes drift like incense through the beams. He stirs the mash in a great iron pot, murmuring a short psalm under his breath. The rhythm of his paddle matches the rhythm of his prayer. The hiss of steam becomes its own kind of liturgy. In that simple, repetitive act, the physical and the spiritual meet. The brew is alive, warm, foaming, fragrant. And so is the devotion. The honey of monastic gardens monasteries kept bees. In hives woven of wicker or carved from hollow logs, The insects worked tirelessly in gardens planted with thyme, lavender, and sage. Their honey was used for medicine, for candles, and of course, for drink. Beekeeping was considered a noble and contemplative craft. The bees, said St. Bernard, were the image of monastic virtue, industrious, silent, and pure. When a brother approached a hive, he did so with calm reverence. He moved slowly, veiled not to protect himself, but to disturb the bees as little as possible. He whispered a prayer to St. Ambrose, the patron of beekeepers, whose tongue, legend said, had been touched by a swarm of bees in infancy, a sign that his words would always be sweet. The honey gathered in the cool mornings was golden and thick, perfumed by the flowers that grew in the cloister yard. It was stirred into warm water, left to ferment in great clay jugs, and guarded in the cellar like treasure. When the monks drank mead, they did not toast. They bowed their heads. For to them, this sweetness was not indulgence. It was gratitude, a memory of the divine order reflected in the smallest creature's labor, the alchemy of faith. The monks did not think of their brewing as chemistry, but as harmony. They saw in it the fingerprints of God, transformation through patience, purity through fire, resurrection through fermentation. They wrote their observations carefully in ledgers. 3 handfuls of barley per measure of water. Heat until the scent of malt fills the hall. Add honey, pray, and wait. They did not know of yeast, not yet by name, but they knew of the invisible breath that animated the mixture. They called it the spiritus, the little spirit, the same Latin root that would later give rise to the word spirit for distilled drink. Every bubble in the brew was to them a mystery, the unseen hand of the Creator at work in the world of men. The cellar of silence. Beneath the monastery ran the cellars, cool, arched chambers carved of stone. Here, barrels rested like sleeping giants. The air smelled of wood, of damp earth, of slow change. Torches flickered, throwing soft gold on the casks. Each bore a mark, the cross of the order, the year, the initials of the brother who brewed it. In those dim corridors, silence was not empty. It was alive with waiting. The monks understood that fermentation could not be hurried, just as prayer could not be forced. Both required surrender. A monk passing through the cellar would sometimes pause, touch the barrel gently, and whisper, "Peace be within you." It was not superstition. It was trust, in process, in time, in the quiet miracles that unfold when no one is watching. The taste of obedience. When the brew was ready, it was brought to the refectory. The brothers gathered at long tables, their hoods low, their hands folded. The abbot would bless the drink before the meal, saying, "May this work of our hands strengthen our bodies to serve our souls." And then, the sound of drinking, not the clamor of thirst, but the synchronized movement of dozens of cups raised and set down in peace. The ale was dark, nourishing, heavy with grain. The mead was bright and clear, tasting faintly of wild flowers and wax. Neither was drunk in excess. The rule of Saint Benedict allowed modest drinking, enough to sustain, not enough to cloud the mind. But even in moderation, the warmth spread. You could see it in their faces, the tension easing, the shoulders lowering, the eyes softening. It was not drunkenness. It was contentment. The guest house, every monastery kept a guest house for travelers. Pilgrims, nobles, beggars, all were welcomed without question. Hospitality was law. For Christ himself, they believed, might appear disguised as a stranger. And so, those weary from the road, often found not just shelter, but drink. A cup of the monastery's ale, poured with care, handed without word. In that moment, the sacred and the ordinary met again. The traveler's hands, cracked and dirty, received the same brew that the monks themselves drank in the quiet of their hall. Some guests crossed themselves, others simply nodded, but all felt the same warmth spread through them. It was not the heat of alcohol that comforted, but the recognition that someone had labored for their peace. The monastic brewer's day. To understand the rhythm of monastic brewing, imagine a day behind the walls. At dawn, the bell rings, matins. The monks file into the chapel, chanting psalms as the sky lightens. At sunrise, lauds. They bless the day, thank God for the dew, and then disperse to their tasks. In the brew house, fires are lit. The smell of grain fills the air. One brother grinds malt on a stone mill. Another carries buckets of spring water from the well. Another tends to the bees. By midday, the cauldron steams, and the sweet scent of brewing drifts through the cloister, mingling with the fragrance of bread from the bakery. At none, the 9th hour, they pray again. By evening, they skim the foam, whispering short prayers over the surface, small invocations of patience and purity. And when night falls, the brew house cools. The brothers sit together for a modest meal, sipping from simple wooden cups, their conversation gentle, their laughter brief. Then, Compline, the final prayer. The candles are snuffed, the halls fall silent, and the brew is left to rest in darkness, like faith itself, unseen, yet alive. The birth of tradition centuries would pass, but these early monastic practices would shape all brewing to come. The monks recorded their recipes, refined their methods, and experimented with herbs. Rosemary for preservation, juniper for flavor, sage for healing. They learned how long to roast grain for darker tones, how to reuse yeast, how to store casks for aging. Their ale became famous far beyond the cloister. Travelers carried word of it to towns and courts. Soon, lords sought to imitate it, and brewers in villages adopted the monks' precision. But what made monastic brew truly distinct was not the taste. It was the intention behind it. It was made in stillness, in prayer, in gratitude. It was never hurried, never cheapened. It was the drink of patience. Honey as benediction. Among the monks, honey had special status. It was the ingredient that turned necessity into joy. In the evening, after the day's labor, they would sometimes mix a spoonful of it into warm milk or ale, a simple comfort before sleep. To them, this was not indulgence, but benediction, a small sweetness before the silence of night. And as they drank, the last light of the candles shimmered on the surface, golden, trembling, like the promise of another dawn. In some abbeys, it became custom for the youngest novice to serve this drink to the elders, bowing before each with the words, "May your rest be." Sweet as the labor was faithful, the response was always the same, a faint smile, a murmur, "Deo gratias." Thanks be to God. The abbot's reflection. In a surviving letter from an 11th century abbot, real or imagined, it hardly matters. He writes, "There are many ways to pray. Some kneel in silence, some sing, some weep. We brew, for through the alchemy of creation we glimpse the patience of God, who ferments the world slowly until all bitterness becomes sweetness." That line might have been forgotten in dusty archives, but its spirit lingers in every glass raised to gentle company. Closing reflections. As the night deepens, the monastery sleeps. The fire in the brew house is out. The cauldron cools, Outside, the bees rest in their hives, dreaming in the dark hum of wings. Somewhere, a monk stirs in his cell, listening to the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the corridors. He smiles, half awake, thinking perhaps of the brew that will greet him at morning's meal, and of the small miracle that continues without his hand. That is the beauty of the monastic brew. It does not need constant tending, only faith. Like the soul, it ferments best in quiet. So as you rest tonight, imagine yourself there. Beneath the stone arches, the candles glow faint on the wall, the scent of honey and grain still lingering in the air. Breathe slowly. The world outside may rage and change, but here, in the timeless rhythm of monks and bees, peace endures. And when you next lift a cup to your lips, perhaps you'll taste it too. That faint, patient sweetness of labor sanctified by stillness. Night had a texture in the early medieval world. Dense, tangible, alive. It was not the thin darkness we know today, scattered by street lamps and window glass. It was deep and whole, an ocean of shadow pressing close to every wall, into which the smallest flame seemed a miracle. Light, then, was not taken for granted. It was made, tended, prayed over, and every glimmer, whether from hearth or candle, was a language unto itself. The first flame. At dusk, the tavern keeper began her ritual. Before the first guest arrived, before the door creaked open, she would kneel by the hearth and coax the sleeping embers from the day's fire. She used a piece of dry moss, a curl of birch bark, a whisper of straw. A spark caught, breathed once, twice, then blossomed into orange. The smell of smoke filled the room, clean, comforting, ancient. To her, it was more than labor. It was continuity. The fire she kindled was the same that had burned the night before, and the night before that. A line of light stretching backward through memory, unbroken, like a prayer whispered across generations. Some said fire was borrowed from heaven, and each night, when it was reborn, it carried a fragment of the divine. Others said it was the spirit of the hearth itself, the soul of the home, kept alive by care and breath. The tavern keeper never said what she believed. She only tended her flame in silence. The dance of shadows, when the fire was strong enough, she added wood, oak or ash, the kind that burned long and steady. The first guests arrived soon after, shaking off the cold. As they entered, they always paused, for the same reason one pauses before a sunrise. The fire drew the eye, its flicker moving across faces, catching in cups, bending in the drafts that whispered through the boards. The tavern filled slowly with a living light, uneven, breathing, flickering. It made every gesture soft. It turned coarse hands into gentle ones, harsh features into kind silhouettes. Shadows moved on the walls like silent companions. Sometimes they seemed to dance with the smoke. Sometimes they stretched long, reaching for the ceiling beams. A candle guttered, and for a heartbeat, the whole room changed shape, as if the world itself were exhaling. Light and shadow together painted the night, neither quite winning, both necessary. Candles of beeswax and tallow. Not all light was equal. The rich burned beeswax, the poor tallow. Beeswax candles were clean, fragrant, golden. They burned with a steady, silent flame that hardly smoked. They were used in churches, monasteries, and by those who could afford the sweetness of purity. Tallow candles, made from rendered fat, told a different story. They smoked, they sputtered, they smelled faintly of the barnyard. But they were cheap, and they burned all the same. In the tavern, one might find both, a wax candle near the shrine of a saint, tallow ones on the tables. Their flames flickered together like social ranks sharing the same warmth. A monk once wrote that beeswax represented the virgin purity of the soul, while tallow stood for the body, mortal, imperfect, yet sustaining life. And so, when both burned in the same room, it was as though heaven and earth met in quiet conversation. The light of labor. Every candle was a product of work. Someone had gathered the wax, boiled the tallow, twisted the wicks. In cottages, women spent long winter days making them, dipping wicks again and again into pots of warm fat until they thickened. The process was slow, repetitive, rhythmic. Each dip cooled the wax just enough to add another layer. Each candle carried the marks of hands, slightly uneven, a bit bent, human. In the evening, when the tavern lights were lit, no one thought of that labor. And yet, it was there, woven into the glow. The flame was a quiet tribute to all the unseen effort that made comfort possible. Light as memory. For those who lived in that time, the fire was not only warmth, it was memory. Children learned to measure their days by its life. When the flame was high, morning. When it dimmed, evening. When it died, sleep. The old spoke of the dead in terms of light. They said, "Her candle burned long," or "His fire went out too soon." To be remembered was to have one's flame still visible, however faint, in another's home. In monasteries, candles were burned for souls in purgatory. In villages, for those lost on the road. And in taverns, sometimes, a single candle stood alone in a niche, unclaimed, unspoken, left for whoever needed its glow. The glow on the faces. The tavern by night was a world of light upon faces. The young looked golden, the old bronze. Eyes caught the gleam and held it. Small suns beneath heavy brows. The fire softened everything. The scars, the worry lines, the dirt, all blurred into the same warm palette. Even arguments seemed to fade beneath it. A man might raise his voice, but the light made his anger foolish, gentle, as though it too would melt in the glow. Those who had spent their day in fields or workshops sat still for a while, staring at the fire as if rediscovering what beauty was. Not the beauty of wealth or perfection, but the humble beauty of something that asks nothing, gives warmth, and vanishes without complaint. Light is timekeeper. Without clocks, people read the passage of hours by the changing fire. The early flames were bright, steady, filled with life. By midnight, the logs had collapsed into a bed of embers, glowing like buried jewels. By the deepest night, even the embers dimmed, leaving only a faint orange breath in the dark. This slow fading was accepted, expected even. It mirrored the rhythm of human strength, the burst of youth, the steady glow of adulthood, the quiet cooling of age. To watch the fire die was not sadness, but wisdom. It reminded them that everything bright must eventually rest, not as loss, but as completion. The candle and the cup. On each table, the candle and the cup were companions. The flame trembled above the honeyed drink, and the reflection of gold met its twin below. When someone lifted their cup, the candlelight followed it upward, shimmering through the mead. In that brief moment, drink and light became one. Warmth for the body, warmth for the eyes. It was a silent poetry, this pairing, liquid sunlight and captive fire. Both born from nature's labor, the bees for honey, the fire for wax. Both gathered by human hands, both symbols of comfort and care. If the tavern had a soul, it was in that union, the golden drink and the golden flame, the fire's voice, Those who sat long enough could hear the fire speak, not in words, but in rhythms. A low hiss when sap escaped the wood, a gentle crack when the log shifted, a pop like laughter when resin caught flame. It was not imagination, or if it was a shared one. People swore that fires had moods. Some burned cheerful, dancing eagerly. Others burned solemn, slow, meditative. The tavern keeper could tell by the sound when to add more wood. Too loud, and it was hungry. Too quiet, and it was dying. She understood its needs as she did those of her guests. Both required feeding. Both desired care. Both gave warmth when tended with patience. The secret of the glow. Late at night, when the guests had gone and the tavern was nearly dark, the keeper would sit alone. She would rake the embers, watching them pulse softly like breathing. The glow reflected in her eyes, turning them into twin lights of their own. She would take the last cup of honey water and sip it slowly, feeling its warmth travel inward. The silence was heavy but kind, the kind that follows fulfillment. Around her, shadows deepened into rest. The smell of smoke lingered, mixing with the faint sweetness of spilled ale and melted wax. This was her favorite hour, when everything that had burned still whispered of life. Candles in the monasteries, far away, in the monasteries, another kind of light burned. Rows of candles before altars, each a prayer made visible. The wax dripped like tears onto polished brass. The shadows of arches moved like wings. A monk walking through the nave at night might pause before one flame, watching it tremble in the draught. He would cup his hands around it, not to warm himself, but to protect the fragile soul of light. He might think, or perhaps he only felt, that all faith was like this candle, needing care, easily extinguished, yet capable of endless renewal. The same flame that burned before the altar burned, in smaller form, in the tavern across the fields. Two worlds, sacred and common, united by the same simple miracle of fire. The glow. Beyond the door. Outside the tavern, the road was dark. But from a distance, travelers could always see the flicker through the shutters, a warm promise in the vast cold. That was how many found their way home, not by stars, not by maps, but by light. The tavern's glow was a beacon, yes, but also an invitation. It said, "Here is life, here is warmth. Come in." And even after the door closed and the last flame faded, the light seemed to remain in the memory of those who saw it, in the air itself, in the story that would be told again tomorrow night. For light, once seen, never truly leaves. It lingers in the mind, in the soft shimmer behind the eyes, when sleep begins to draw near. Closing reflections. Now, as you listen in the dark, think of that light. The kind that once filled every tavern, every monastery, every lonely cottage on the edge of the forest. It was not bright, not constant, not eternal. But it was enough. Enough to work by, enough to eat by, enough to dream by. And perhaps that is what mattered most, not the abundance of light, but the intimacy of it. How it revealed only what was near, faces, hands, a cup, a flame. The rest remained mystery. So as your own room dims and shadows grow long, remember that you are part of the same lineage of glow, a line of fire stretching back through centuries, from your small lamp to their single candle, from your sigh to their quiet laughter. Light, after all, is the gentlest continuity between the living and the remembered. In the dim warmth of the tavern, the air was rich with scent, not just of drink, but of food. Simple food, the kind that filled the stomach without ceremony, that spoke of fields and firewood rather than feasts. The early medieval table was modest, but it was sincere. What people ate in those quiet hours before sleep was never meant to impress. It was meant to restore. The bread, the broth, the herbs, the warmth, all carried the same message. You have worked. Now rest. The loaf and its shadow bread was the beginning of everything. It was the heart of the meal, the calendar of the year, the record of labor. Every village had its own bread, and each loaf told its story, of soil, of weather, of the hands that kneaded it. In the poor cottages, bread was coarse and brown, made from rye or barley, sometimes mixed with oats or peas when grain was scarce. It was dense, heavy, slightly sour, more sustenance than pleasure. It cracked rather than crumbled. It required chewing, patience, respect. In taverns, bread was cut in thick slices and served as both plate and food. A slab of dark bread might hold stew or meat, soaking up the juices until it became soft enough to eat. When the plate was gone, the meal was over. To break bread with another was to acknowledge kinship. In the tavern, even strangers shared the loaf without question. One man tore, another passed. A third bowed his head briefly before taking his piece. No words were needed. The act itself was communion enough. The broth of the hearth. If bread was the foundation, broth was its companion. The warmth that softened both food and heart. The evening broth was rarely rich. It was made from what the day had offered. Bones simmered for hours, a handful of barley, leeks, turnips, herbs. Sometimes it was clear, sometimes cloudy, always fragrant. A tavern's pot was never truly empty. Each day's broth began with what remained of the last, a living thread of flavor that carried memory forward. The pot hung over the fire, blackened with years of use. Its rim was crusted with salt and steam. Every so often, the keeper would lift the lid, stir the surface, and inhale. Not to test, but to listen. The sound of the simmer told her everything. Guests ate in silence at first, dipping bread into the bowl, watching the steam rise and curl. The broth warmed from within, loosening joints, slowing thought. There was something almost sacred in it, not in doctrine, but in rhythm. To sip broth beside a fire was to participate in the oldest ritual of comfort. The table's landscape looked closer at a medieval tavern table, and you will see its simplicity. A rough board of oak, scarred with knife marks and burn rings. Wooden bowls, pewter cups, a handful of spoons carved from horn. No tablecloth, no silver, no excess. Yet, when lit by candlelight, it had its own kind of beauty, honest, lived-in, human. The table was more than a surface. It was a meeting ground. Here, men and women laid down the day's burdens. They spoke less of what they had done than of what they hoped the weather would bring tomorrow. Between them stood not finery, but sustenance. A loaf, a bowl, a jug. The holy trinity of survival. Cheese and salted things. Cheese was a quiet presence on every table. A pale wedge from cow or goat's milk, firm and mild. It was eaten sparingly, not because it was rare, but because it was precious. The condensed patience of time and care. Monks often brought wheels of cheese from nearby abbeys, their surfaces brushed with salt and ash. They were traded, sliced, sometimes melted into the evening broth for travelers. Alongside it might sit something salted, a bit of fish from the coast, a strip of pork, a handful of preserved beans. Salt, then, was more than seasoning. It was life extended. It turned the fleeting abundance of summer into the steady endurance of winter. Each bite of salted meat was a small triumph, a reminder that foresight and fire could keep hunger at bay. Herbs of healing and flavor. In the dim corners of the tavern kitchen, bundles of herbs hung from beams: thyme, sage, rosemary, mint. They perfumed the air, even when not used, a faint echo of the garden in the dead of winter. Herbs were the poor person's spice and the healer's whisper. They seasoned food, soothed ailments, and flavored drink. A pinch of sage might be added to broth for strength, a sprig of thyme for courage, a leaf of mint to calm the belly after ale. The tavern keeper, often a woman of age and memory, knew these uses by instinct. She stirred, tasted, nodded, never writing, never measuring. The recipe lived in her bones, the sweet of honey and fruit. For sweetness, there was honey, of course, and dried fruit when it could be afforded. Apples shriveled on strings near the fire. Figs and prunes soaked in warm water or ale, softened to make simple puddings. Sometimes the keeper would drizzle honey over porridge for children or weary pilgrims. Its scent mingled with smoke and bread, becoming the fragrance of evening itself. Sweetness was not expected every night. It was an event, a soft luxury, a reminder that life could offer gentleness even in scarcity. The common spoon, one of the quietest acts in the tavern, was the passing of the spoon. Not everyone owned one. Spoons were communal. They were washed between uses in the same basin of warm water. A man might finish his broth, rinse the spoon, and hand it to the woman beside him. No one thought twice of it. It was not poverty, but practicality, and a symbol of shared humanity. What mattered was not possession, but participation. The spoon passed like a word in a conversation, small, brief, connecting, the meal as prayer. Most meals began without ceremony, but many ended with quiet gratitude. Someone might murmur a short blessing, or simply trace a cross over the bowl before rising. It was not about religion so much as rhythm, the acknowledgement of enough. In a world where famine was a frequent visitor, enough was holiness. The last crumbs were brushed from the table into a handkerchief. Leftovers were wrapped for tomorrow. The pot was covered, the fire banked. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. That was the true etiquette of the medieval meal, the comfort of warmth. After the food, the body grew heavy, not from excess, but from balance. The warmth spread slowly, from chest to limbs, settling like a gentle weight. The room filled with that quiet drowsiness known to every tavern at midnight. The sound of slow breaths, of chairs creaking, of a dog turning once before sleep. In that hush, the memory of the meal lingered. The taste of barley and honey, the faint bitterness of herbs, the softness of bread soaked in broth. The human body, for all its restlessness, understood this kind of peace instinctively. It was the body saying, "You may rest now. The day has been answered." The keeper's pot, long. After the guests had gone, the tavern keeper remained by the fire. She washed the bowls in warm water, stacked them neatly, and leaned her elbow on the table. The pot still simmered faintly. One last bubble, one last sigh. She stirred it once more, added a bit of water, a pinch of salt, a thought. Tomorrow's broth had begun. She sipped from her own bowl, slow and deliberate, letting the warmth travel deep. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters. Inside, the air was still, filled only with the scent of grain, smoke, and contentment. Food is memory. Food is mercy. In the medieval world, to eat well was not a mark of wealth. It was a mark of grace. Meals were small acts of mercy, given and received daily. Each loaf shared, each bowl passed, was a thread in the fragile fabric of community. Even now, centuries later, the same comfort endures. The smell of warm bread, the steam of soup, the golden thread of honey and tea, they carry that ancient reassurance. You are safe. You are fed. You may rest. Closing reflections. And so, as the tavern grows quiet and the last candle trembles toward sleep, imagine the table in front of you. The loaf half gone, the bowl empty but fragrant, the spoon resting across its rim like a soldier at ease. Outside, frost covers the thatch. Inside, the last ember glows. The night holds its breath. These are not grand scenes of history, yet they are the true pulse of the past. Moments of small peace, the kind that built endurance into the human heart. As you drift toward sleep, let the warmth of that ancient meal follow you. The slow simmer of broth, the quiet breaking of bread, the gentle sweetness of honey. And may your dreams be full, but never heavy. May they taste of rest, of comfort, of home. Winter, in the early Middle Ages, came not as a visitor, but as a ruler. It arrived with silence, covered the earth in its white seal, and lingered far beyond welcome. Nights stretched long and heavy. The air itself felt solid, as though time had frozen with the frost. In those nights, every sound seemed sharper. The howl of wind through the thatch, the crack of ice in the well, the moan of trees burdened with snow. Darkness pressed against every shutter, seeking entry. And yet, within the tavern, the world remained bright and alive. A single fire could keep winter at bay. A few cups of warm drink could turn hardship into comfort. The first frost of the season was always noticed. Children would run outside at dawn, tracing their fingers over the white patterns on the grass, marveling at how the world had turned to crystal overnight. Farmers rose early to see if their crops had survived. The tavern keeper stepped into the yard to fetch water and paused, breath visible, every step crunching like brittle glass beneath her boots. Inside, she lit the morning fire, coaxing it from the embers she had hidden under ash the night before. The smoke rose slow and blue, filling the room with the faint scent of wet wood and yesterday's warmth. Soon, steam would rise from a pot of water, and she'd stir in honey to make the first cup of the day. That cup, more ritual than necessity, marked the beginning of the season of endurance. Nights that lasted forever. In winter, darkness was a second skin. It arrived before the evening bell and lingered until the late morning, swallowing the hours in between. The tavern became the refuge, the only place where people could still feel the rhythm of human time. By late afternoon, the benches were full. Travelers brushed snow from their cloaks. Villagers stamped the cold from their boots. The air grew dense with the smell of wool, smoke, and relief. Firelight shimmered on wet sleeves and brightened the cheeks of those who had walked through storm and chill to reach this one warm room. There was no hurry in these nights. The fire burned long and steady, and so did the hours. Stories stretched like shadows, laughter grew round and soft, and even silence felt companionable. The sound of the wind to listen, really listen, to how winter sounds through old wood. It hums, it knocks, it whispers, it sings. The tavern walls groaned as if in conversation with the elements. Sometimes the door rattled suddenly, and everyone looked up, half expecting it to open on its own. But it never did. The wind could enter the chimney, could moan beneath the roof, but it could not cross the firelight. Men would glance toward the door, smile faintly, and raise their cups as though in defiance. It was not courage, not exactly. It was more quiet agreement with the season. You do what you must, and we will do the same. The glow of breath in the colder corners of the room, breath showed like smoke. You could see the rhythm of people's breathing. Soft clouds that drifted upward and vanished into the beams. It was strange and beautiful, this visible proof of life. Each exhale glowed briefly in the light, like a spirit made visible, then faded before it could be caught. Children liked to play with their own breath, pretending to blow clouds into the air. Old men laughed softly at that, remembering when they too had done it. The tavern keeper always made sure the fire burned strong enough so that no one's breath lasted too long. When the air was warm enough to hide it again, she smiled. It meant the room had come alive. Frosted windows. The windows of the tavern were small, often just animal bladders stretched thin, sometimes real glass if the place was prosperous. In either case, frost found them easily. Patterns formed there through the night, delicate forests, spirals, and feathery stars. Some said it was the breath of angels painting while the world slept. Others joked that it was the ghosts of last summer, frozen in place. The frost became its own form of art, nature's nightly offering, fleeting as dreams. In the morning, when the sun returned, it would melt, leaving trails of water that caught the light like tears. The fire as a gathering soul. Every tavern had one unspoken law in winter. No one sat too far from the fire. It was the soul of the room, bright, magnetic, alive. Those nearest tended it, shifting logs, coaxing sparks. Those farther away leaned forward, palms extended as though praying to it. The fire accepted everyone without discrimination. Its warmth was communal, unowned, impartial. Sometimes, when the wood cracked loudly, people would laugh, as if the fire had joined the conversation. It wasn't superstition. It was companionship. In that world of endless cold, warmth had personality. It spoke. It responded. It remembered. The sharing of warmth. There was a kind of closeness born of winter that no other season knew. It was not romantic, nor ceremonial. It was practical, human, and tender. Two strangers might share a cloak if they sat near a draught. Hands would pass near the same flame, their shadows overlapping. If a traveler's boots were soaked, another would offer a dry pair of stockings or a seat near the fire's edge. No one thought of these gestures as kindness. They were simply survival done together. When the world outside could kill with cold, the smallest generosity was sacred. The taste of winter drinks. Winter changed what was drunk, too. The cold demanded heavier, thicker things. The light summer ale gave way to dark, smoky brews, barley roasted longer, honey boiled deeper, herbs steeped stronger. The tavern keeper might add cloves or cinnamon if she had them, rare spices brought by traders from far lands. Their scent filled the air, mingling with pine and smoke, turning the room into a vessel of warmth. Sometimes she would mix in a little butter or egg yolk to make the drink richer. The guests called it winter milk, though it was neither milk nor sweet, just thick, golden, and comforting. To sip from it was to feel the frost retreat from one's bones. The songs of the cold music in winter sounded different. Voices were lower, slower, less ornamented. The songs were about endurance, of fire, of love, of faith. One might begin softly near the hearth, and others would join, not in harmony, but in solidarity. A dozen voices, rough from smoke and ale, weaving together in warmth. Outside, the wind answered. The two musics, human and elemental, blended, neither overpowering the other. When the song ended, there was no applause. only the sigh of the fire and the gentle shifting of logs. It was not performance. It was survival made beautiful. The watchers of the fire. As the night deepened, some fell asleep at the tables, heads on arms, feet near the hearth. Others lingered, watching the flames. There is a particular stillness that comes in the hour before midnight. The kind that hums, not with silence, but with presence. The fire moves more slowly then. The embers pulse like the last beats of a heart. Every sound, the pop of sap, the whisper of falling ash, feels magnified. In that stillness, thought itself slows. Worry fades. The mind drifts between waking and dreaming, warmed by the rhythm of the fire's breathing. Outside the tavern beyond the door, the world was vast and white. Snow swallowed sound. Even the church bells seemed distant, dulled by the air. Animals huddled in barns. Wolves roamed the edges of the forest, their cries carrying across the frozen fields. Above it all, the stars burned bright, sharper, colder, nearer than in any other season. From a distance, the tavern's light was a single flicker, trembling but steadfast. Travelers seeing it across the plain knew they were saved. No matter how long the road or how deep the cold, there was a fire waiting somewhere. Morning after frost. At dawn, when the last embers glowed faintly red, the tavern grew pale. The cold crept back in through the walls. The air smelled of ashes and smoke, the remains of warmth, now memory. The keeper rose quietly, covering those who had slept by the fire with blankets. She smiled to herself at the sight, a pile of humanity, breathing gently, untroubled. Outside, frost still covered the ground, but the first hint of sunlight painted the snow gold. The long night had been endured, and in that endurance was a kind of triumph, not loud, not heroic, but enduring. Midnight in the early medieval world was not an hour. It was a state of being. There were no clocks to divide the dark, no chimes to mark its center. Night was one long breath, drawn and released slowly by the sleeping earth. And yet, those who lived then knew when the true middle of it had come. It was when the fire in the hearth burned low, but still glowed faintly red. When the dogs stopped stirring. When even the drunkard's laughter had faded into murmurs. When the tavern, the village, and the fields beyond had all fallen under the same soft hush. That was the hour the medieval world seemed to hold its breath, poised between waking and dream. The sleeping room, the tavern, once alive with voices and light, now lay in near darkness. The tables were scattered with cups, empty and turned on their sides. A loaf of bread, half eaten, rested beside a dull knife. Ashes covered the fire like a gray blanket, glowing faintly beneath. Those who had not gone home slept where they sat, heads resting on arms, cloaks pulled tight around shoulders. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, ale, and quiet humanity. Every sound was magnified. The creak of wood as someone shifted in sleep, the sigh of wind pressing against the shutters, the faint drip of melting frost from the eaves. The tavern keeper sat for a while before going to her own bed, her eyes half closed, but still alert to the smallest sound. The caper of warmth, the guardian of rest. When she finally lay down, it was not with exhaustion, but with the deep calm that follows completion. The night would look after itself now. The world beyond the door. Outside, the cold world slept under its own dark blanket. The road stretched pale under the moonlight. The trees, bare and patient, whispered in voices too soft to carry. In distant cottages, candles flickered once and went out. In monasteries, monks rose for matins. their low chants spilling softly into the stillness, like ripples across frozen water. But in most of the world, there was silence. No wheels turned, no bells rang. The night belonged not to sound, but to listening. Even the animals were still. Horses breathing gently in their stalls, chickens tucked under wings, cats curled on piles of straw. The silence was so deep that a single owl's call could feel like a presence. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of fullness, the kind that gathers around you like wool. The fire's fading heart. The last firelight in the tavern was no longer flame, only glow. A low pulse of orange coals under white ash, breathing faintly like a sleeper's chest. If you watched long enough, you could see the embers blink, brightening, dimming, brightening again. They seemed to think, to remember, to dream. That small glow was enough to keep the dark at bay. It was the tavern's heartbeat, quiet, steady, patient. Somewhere, a log cracked softly, releasing a faint whiff of pine. The sound was enough to make a dog lift its head, blink, and sigh before sinking back into sleep. Every living thing in that room had surrendered to rest, even the fire. The sleeping faces look around that silent tavern, and you would see the poetry of exhaustion. The farmer's hand, still rough with soil, resting open on the table. The traveler's satchel fallen beside his feet, untouched. The old man's face tilted toward the warmth, his lips curved faintly as if still smiling in dream. Each sleeper carried the shape of their day, the imprint of effort, softened now by rest. The furrows on their brows eased. The lines of worry vanished. The light that remained caught them gently, turning their worn features into something almost peaceful. Even the humblest face seemed noble in the half-dark. Sleep, in those hours, was democracy. It made all equal. The rich, the poor, the holy, the weary, all sank into the same still sea. It was said that dreams came more vividly in winter, when nights were long and bellies full. They came not as grand visions, but as small, flickering stories, a harvest that never failed, a lost loved one walking through a field of light, a fire that never went out. Sometimes dreams were said to be messages, carried by the wind, whispered by saints or spirits, but most were simple, the mind's gentle way of weaving comfort. In the tavern, dreams floated like invisible smoke, drifting between the beams, mingling with the scent of honey and wood. Each sleeper carried their own, but all shared the same rhythm of breath, a chorus of rest. The keeper's vigil. In some nights, the tavern keeper could not sleep. She would rise quietly, wrap herself in a shawl, and move through the shadows. She checked the fire, the door, the resting guests. Her steps were soft, her breath steady. She knew the weight of silence and how to move within it. Sometimes she stood by the window and looked out at the frost. The moonlight made the world shimmer like glass. The village was silent, the trees motionless. It felt as though the entire earth had fallen into a single, perfect pause. She whispered a short prayer, not to any saint in particular, but to the night itself. Keep them safe until morning. Then she returned to her chair by the fire and sat with her eyes half closed, half in this world, half in the next. The sacredness of stillness. In an age before engines, before lamps and clocks, stillness was not interruption. It was balance. Silence was the natural companion of sound, as night was today. People did not fear it, they leaned into it. To wake in the middle of the night and hear nothing was a kind of reassurance. It meant the world was in order. It meant no alarm, no disaster, no cry of wolves. only peace. In that stillness, one could sense the pulse of larger things, the breath of the land, the slow drift of stars, the turning of unseen heavens. It was the hour when thought became prayer without words. And when morning came, no one spoke of it, because everyone had felt it. The spirit of the night. To medieval minds, night was never empty. It had its own inhabitants, not ghosts and terror, but presences of meaning. The night was said to be filled with souls at rest, angels in passing, the quiet murmur of creation continuing unseen. When the wind sighed through the cracks, people said it was the voice of ancestors checking that the living were warm. When a spark leapt from the fire, they said it was a small blessing, sent to remind them that light always returns. Such beliefs did not frighten. They comforted. They gave shape to the unseen care that wrapped around human life in those vulnerable hours. The hour between worlds. Monks spoke of midnight as the hour between worlds, when heaven leaned closest to earth, when prayers rose most clearly. In abbeys across Europe, bells rang softly, waking the brothers for matins. Their voices, low and unhurried, moved through the dark like water through stone. Meanwhile, in taverns and cottages, people dreamed, unaware, yet somehow connected. It was as if all of humanity breathed together in one long exhale. The line between sacred and ordinary blurred. The same peace that filled the monastery filled the tavern too. Different prayers, same silence. The return of the fire. Around what would later be called 2 or 3 in the morning, the fire stirred again. A small collapse of coals, a brief spark, a whisper of life. It was enough to wake the tavern keeper. She rose, stretched, and added a piece of wood, not too large, not too small. The new flame curled up gently, licking the darkness. The light grew, soft, amber, alive. She watched it for a while, then smiled and whispered, "There you are." For her, keeping the fire alive through the night was not duty. It was devotion. The fire's endurance was the tavern's heartbeat, and through it, the heartbeat of the world. Dreams fading into dawn. As the faintest gray touched the windows, the dreams of those within began to fade. The sleepers stirred. Slowly, unwillingly. One turned over, another sighed, another reached for a cloak. Outside, the birds began their morning hymns. One at a time, cautious at first, then joined by others until the air trembled with life again. The tavern filled with a soft, golden half-light. The night spell broke, not abruptly, but like a mist lifting. The tavern keeper smiled to herself. Another night had passed. Another silence had been safely held. She poured herself the first cup of honey water of the day, warm and clear, and sat quietly while the world woke around her. Closing reflections. The midnight hours of the early medieval world were neither fearful nor lonely. They were a kind of sacred sleep, a space where work ceased, where time softened, where every living thing was granted a brief return to peace. In the glow of fading embers and the rhythm of steady breath, humanity found its oldest prayer: to rest and be renewed. The deepest part of night has passed. The embers, long silent, glow faintly again beneath their veil of ash. Outside, a cold wind sighs through the thatch, brushing against the walls like a cautious hand. It is the hour before dawn, a time without name, when darkness has grown gentle, and the world, though not yet awake, has begun to think of waking. Inside the tavern, everything still lies in shadow. But the shadow is softer now, blue-gray instead of black. Shapes slowly return, the outline of a bench, the glint of a cup, the sleeping curve of a human shoulder under a cloak. The silence is complete, yet alive, as though the air itself holds its breath, waiting for the first sound that will break it. The keeper's rising. The tavern keeper stirs first, as she always does. She does not need a bell to wake her. Her body has learned the rhythm of the fire. Even in sleep, she seems to hear when the embers falter. She sits up slowly, her joints stiff, the blanket falling to her lap. The room smells of smoke and old wood, of honey and wool. Her breath is visible for a moment in the chill. Without a word, she moves toward the hearth. The ashes resist at first, cold and heavy, but she knows where to find the living core. She stirs it gently with the iron poker, a small motion, a quiet ritual, until the faintest orange pulse emerges. She adds a bit of dry moss, then thin twigs. The spark catches, breathes, grows. The fire is reborn, and with it, the tavern's heart begins to beat again. The room brightens one shade deeper into warmth. She leans close, feeling the gentle heat against her face, her expression neither joy nor duty, but something simpler. Contentment. The day has begun. The world outside. The village lies beneath a quilt of mist. The frost has not yet melted. It glitters faintly in the moon's fading light. Roosters, sensing something in the air, crow tentatively, as though testing the strength of morning. The sky above the distant hills shifts almost imperceptibly from black to deep indigo. No sun yet, but the promise of one. Smoke begins to rise from a few chimneys, thin, straight, shy. Somewhere, a cow lowing breaks the silence. A shepherd coughs once before opening his door. All across the land, life begins to remember itself. The scent of morning back in the tavern. The keeper feeds the fire a few thicker logs and sets a pot above it. The wood sizzles softly as frost melts from its bark. She pours water from a jug, adds a spoonful of honey, and waits for the steam to rise. The scent fills the air, not sweet exactly, but golden, clean, comforting. Soon the smell of grain joins it. She drops a handful of oats into another pot, stirring slowly with a wooden spoon. The sound is small and rhythmic, the soft scrape of spoon against iron. This sound, more than any bell, is the signal of morning. It says, "You may wake now. You are safe. The world is ready for you again." The first movements. One by one, the sleepers begin to stir. A cough, a rustle of straw, the shifting creak of a bench. A man lifts his head, confused for a moment, then smiles as he remembers where he is. A woman near the hearth adjusts her shawl and reaches for her boots. Someone yawns loudly, not rudely, but with the honest abandon of one who has slept deeply. No one speaks yet. The silence of night is still too near, too sacred. They move carefully within it, like guests in a cathedral. The keeper pours the first cup of honey water and sets it on the table. Steam curls upward, catching the firelight like silk. The man nods in thanks without a word. The sound of his first sip seems almost loud in the hush. That small, soft swallow that means the day has begun. The color of early light. Outside, the darkness finally begins to thin. Through the small windows, a pale blue light seeps in, cautious, uncertain. The frost on the pane sparkles, melting at its edges. It is not yet sunlight, but its messenger. The gray light that touches everything gently, as though waking it by a hand. The tavern transforms under this new illumination. The rough wood of the tables gleams faintly. The iron pots catch reflections like dull silver. Even the smoke from the fire takes on color, faint rose, faint gold. It is the light that painters centuries later would call the hour of mercy. Neither night nor day, shadow nor brilliance, the world in its softest form. The first voices. At last, someone speaks. A man near the door murmurs a good morning. His voice is rough but kind. Another answers. Then another. The tavern begins to breathe again, conversation returning in fragments, small, domestic phrases. How long till the sun? Cold enough to crack the well. Another cup, if you please. The keeper smiles quietly and refills their mugs. The sound of liquid pouring into clay mingles with low laughter. The first laughter of the day, still half asleep but alive. Outside, a cart creaks by, its wheels singing against the frost. The sound blends with the faint crowing of roosters and the bark of a distant dog. Morning, at last, has arrived in full. Breakfast of the humble. The tavern's morning meal is as simple as its night was rich. Porridge thickened with barley or rye, a few slices of yesterday's bread toasted on the hearth, perhaps a small piece of cheese or apple if fortune allows. Steam rises from each bowl like ghostly fingers. Men eat slowly, speaking little, grateful for warmth. The room smells of oats, honey, and smoke. The trinity of peasant comfort. For those who must travel, the keeper wraps bits of bread and cheese in cloth, tying it neatly with string. She never charges for it in winter. She says simply, "The road takes enough." The monk's morning. Sometimes, a monk stops by on his way to the abbey, his robe dusted with frost, his breath visible in the air. He drinks his cup in silence, his fingers wrapped tightly around it. When he is done, he places a small wooden token on the table, not payment, but blessing. A carved cross or a saint's name scratched in the grain. The keeper nods, tucks it into a small box, and whispers, "Peace with your steps." He smiles faintly, gathers his robe, and walks into the mist. His footprints linger for a while in the frost before fading, as all things do. The sun's arrival. At last, the first beam of sunlight breaks the horizon. It slips into the tavern through the cracks of the door, a single golden thread that stretches across the floorboards. It climbs slowly, touching a table leg, a jug, a bowl, before finally finding the fire. The two lights meet and mingle, the gold of the sun and the red of the hearth. The tavern glows with quiet glory. The frost outside melts. The mist rises. The air, once gray, turns soft amber. The day has fully arrived. The keeper's reflection. When the guests have gone, the travelers on the road, the villagers to their fields, the keeper sits once more by the hearth. The room is nearly empty now. Only the faint clatter of cups being washed and the slow settling of ash. She takes her own cup of honey water and drinks it in silence, watching the fire's movement. Her hands rest folded on her knees. The light of morning falls on her face, and she closes her eyes for a moment, feeling its warmth. She has kept the fire alive through another night, and in some small way, the world itself with it. The philosophy of morning. There was a saying in the medieval world, "Night teaches patience, morning teaches gratitude." Perhaps it was true. After the long silence, even the smallest sounds felt miraculous. The cluck of hens, the whistle of wind through the chimney, the scrape of bread on the cutting board. Morning was not an event. It was a gradual forgiveness. It arrived softly, without spectacle, yet carried the strength to renew everything it touched. Each day began as if it were the first. And in that quiet repetition, people found comfort, not in change, but in return. Every tavern, in every village, was built not just from wood and stone, but from people. They were its walls, its warmth, its memory. When the fire burned, it burned for them. When the night grew cold, their laughter made it live again. The medieval tavern was more than a place to drink. It was a hearth shared by the weary, a refugee for strangers, and the quiet heart of the community, where hands met over wooden tables and eyes softened in the glow of common light. It was where humanity, stripped of rank and pride, remembered itself. Faces in the glow. If you sat quietly near the fire, you could learn the whole rhythm of a village just by watching faces. There was the blacksmith, shoulders broad, eyes red from sparks, whose laugh could shake the beams above. Beside him, the shepherd, hands calloused, beard full of straw, his voice slow and melodic as if shaped by the hills. The seamstress sat near the door, her fingers always moving even as she listened. The miller's wife leaned close to her, sharing gossip between smiles. And in the corner, a wandering friar sipped his ale, nodding to the rhythm of their speech as though it were a psalm. No one here was rich, and few were young, but each face carried the soft dignity of survival. They spoke with the calm assurance of people who had done enough for the day. In the firelight, every wrinkle became a map, every shadow a story untold. The language without words. Most evenings, there was a moment when words would fall away. Conversation would drift into silence, but the silence would not be empty. It was full of breath, of thought, of presence. A hand might reach across the table to refill another's cup. A nod might replace a sentence. A sigh might be as eloquent as a song. In that age, people spoke with gestures more than we do now, because they understood that silence could hold meaning too. There was kindness in how a loaf was shared, grace in how one waited for another to finish speaking, humor in a sideways glance. The fire was their common language. It translated everything. The bonds of warmth, in those times, was the truest form of wealth. And because it was rare, it was shared freely. When a traveler entered shivering from the cold, the bench nearest the fire was always made ready. A stranger's name was not asked before a cup was offered. It was assumed that anyone who had walked through frost and wind deserved a place in the circle. The old saying was simple. He who warms another warms himself twice. In the glow of the hearth, that saying became truth. There was no difference between giving and receiving. The warmth belonged to all, and so did the peace. The tavern keeper's grace. The keeper was the quiet soul of it all, steady, watchful, often unthanked. She moved between the tables like a memory of order, her presence constant, her voice soft. She knew everyone's way of sitting, of speaking, of sighing. She could tell from a man's face how far he had traveled, or from a woman's eyes what kind of week it had been. She poured, listened, sometimes offered advice, sometimes said nothing. But all who left her tavern left steadier than they came. Her kindness was practical, not sentimental. A warm drink, a blanket, a place to sit. The small things that keep despair away. When someone tried to pay with more than coin, with stories or songs or blessings, she accepted those too. And so her tavern became an exchange of souls, not goods. Children and the old sometimes. Children would appear near the doorway, drawn by the smell of bread or the sound of laughter. They did not enter boldly. They lingered at the threshold, half curious, half shy. Someone would always notice. A bit of crust, a piece of cheese, a sweetened drop of honeyed water. Small gifts passed down the line with quiet amusement. The children would take them, wide-eyed, whisper thanks, and vanish back into the cold. No one ever chased them away. To feed a child was to feed the future, and in those times, that was the purest faith. At the other end of the room, the old men sat close to the hearth. They spoke little, their eyes lost somewhere in the fire. Sometimes they dozed, sometimes they simply watched the flames, as if waiting for an answer to an unasked question. When they smiled, it was like embers glowing under ash, faint but enough, the laughter that heals. There was laughter too, not loud or careless, but warm and slow, like honey poured from a pot. It came from shared jokes, familiar mistakes, the small ironies of daily life. The laughter of the tavern had no audience. It was laughter for each other, not at each other. A man who had dropped his spoon might grin and shrug, and soon the whole room would follow. Not mockery, but recognition. A reminder that everyone had known clumsiness, fatigue, folly. In a world so fragile, laughter was rebellion. It said, "We are still here." The songs of fellowship. When the night was deep enough and the fire steady, someone would begin a song. It might be a ballad or a harvest tune or a wordless hum. Others joined in, not always in time or pitch, but always in spirit. The songs were not for entertainment. They were for belonging. The melody wound through the room like a thread, binding people together, each voice imperfect. Yet together, they made something whole. In those moments, no one was a stranger. Even the loneliest traveler became part of a chorus. The songs were never written down, never performed beyond that night. They lived for a few minutes, then vanished, like sparks rising from the fire, glowing once before fading into memory. The stranger at the door. Every tavern had its nights of surprise, when, late in the evening, a stranger arrived as the wind howled outside. The door would open with a gust of cold, and heads would turn, not in suspicion, but in quiet acknowledgement. Without question, a cup would be poured, a seat made ready. The newcomer, still trembling, would sit by the fire. His hands would thaw, his face would soften. Someone would ask gently, "From where?" He might answer, or he might not. It didn't matter. The important thing was that he was no longer cold. By the time he rose to leave, the tavern would remember him. Not his name, but his warmth, left behind in the circle. The art of listening. In that world, conversation was not competition. It was rhythm. People took turns not because they were told to, but because they had learned the beauty of pauses. When someone spoke, others listened fully, leaning in slightly, eyes steady, hands still. No interruptions, no haste. Even silence was respected. It was said that in silence, truth settled to the bottom like honey in water. Listening was not passive. It was a gift, a way of saying, "You matter. I have time." In those low-lit rooms, time itself seemed to stretch, soft and generous, allowing every story to unfold at its own pace. The quiet acts of mercy. Sometimes, kindness went unnoticed. Someone paying for another's drink when they couldn't. A cloak draped over a sleeping guest. A loaf left outside a poor widow's door before dawn. No one spoke of it. No one needed to. In small villages, mercy was not a virtue to be admired. It was a habit, as natural as breathing, as necessary as warmth. And though no one wrote these names in books or carved them into stone, the tavern remembered. The walls absorbed it. The beams held it. The fire carried it onward. The hearth's unseen circle. When the fire burned low and the guests had gone, the keeper often sat a while longer. The benches were empty, but she could still feel the presence of those who had sat there. Their voices, their laughter, their sighs. She would look at the empty cups and see not waste, but echoes. Every shared meal, every drink, every gesture of kindness left something behind. The tavern was not just a building. It was a vessel of warmth that gathered all those fleeting acts into a single, quiet legacy. And in that warmth, in that space of ordinary grace, humanity endured. All things, even warmth, must rest. Every night, no matter how long, bends gently toward its end. In the old taverns of the medieval world, this moment was neither sad nor hurried. It arrived naturally, like the slow dimming of a candle that has burned faithfully to its last inch of wax. The fire has done its duty. The cups are empty. The air smells faintly of smoke and sweetness. The people have gone home, leaving only silence and the faint warmth of their presence. The tavern stands as it always has, humble, patient, at peace. And in this stillness, one begins to understand what the night has truly given. The quiet after company. There is a particular silence that follows fellowship, not loneliness, but fullness. It hums in the walls and settles on the floor like dust made of memory. The tavern keeper moves slowly through the room, her steps soft on the wooden boards. She gathers the empty mugs, one by one, as if handling relics. Each still holds a faint trace of warmth, a print of fingers, a shadow of laughter. She wipes the tables with a damp cloth, not to erase, but to close, to make peace between what has been said and what remains unsaid. The fire, reduced now to quiet embers, glows faintly beneath its thin layer of ash. It pulses with the slow rhythm of sleep. Even flame, after its brightness, needs rest. The keeper's reflection. She pauses before the hearth and sits down on the same bench that has held generations before her. Her hands rest on her knees. The faint light of dawn presses against the window, pale and kind. She remembers fragments, the shepherd's laughter, the friar's song, the whisper of the wind outside when the door last opened. Each night feels the same, and yet none ever truly repeats. Each carries its own small constellation of souls who met, warmed, and moved on. She smiles softly and whispers, "They were good tonight." It is not a prayer, not a blessing, but something in between. A thank you spoken into the air, to the invisible presence of those who shared the warmth. The last cup of honey. Before she begins her own rest, she prepares the final ritual. From the shelf, she takes the small clay cup, chipped but cherished, and fills it with warm water. Into it, she stirs a spoon of honey, thick and golden. The honey moves slowly, melting like amber into sunlight. It catches the last light of the fire and glows. She lifts it to her lips, closes her eyes, and drinks. The warmth travels inward, not heat, but comfort. The taste is simple, familiar, eternal. It is the same drink she has made every night of her life, and perhaps the same her mother made, and her mother before that. She sits a moment longer, letting the sweetness rest on her tongue. The world outside grows brighter, but she does not rush. Morning will come fully soon, and with it, the noise of life. But for now, the tavern belongs to stillness. The memory of light all over the countryside, other taverns close in the same slow way. Fires fade to gray, doors are barred, windows still shimmer faintly with the echo of flame. The roads are quiet now, but if one were to pass by at this hour, they might see a thin line of smoke rising, straight and delicate, marking the place where warmth has lived through the night. That smoke is memory. It carries the stories of laughter, of kindness, of the shared breath that made the long hours shorter. It rises toward the pale sky and disappears, but what it carried remains. invisible in the morning air. The world awakes. The tavern keeper steps outside for a moment, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. The fields stretch before her, silver with dew. The sun peeks over the horizon, not golden yet, just soft and white, like milk poured slowly into the dark. She listens to the faint creaking of wagons, the low hum of cattle, the first shouts from the mill across the stream. The day has begun anew, but she still feels the night inside her, a warmth that lingers behind the ribs, gentle and slow. She takes one last breath of the cold morning air and returns inside. The tavern feels smaller now, cozier. Its shadows are harmless, its silence complete. She will sleep for a few hours while others labor. When evening comes again, she will light the fire, set the cups in place, and begin the quiet ritual of gathering warmth once more. The philosophy of continuity. In that world, a world without haste, repetition was not burden, but grace. The same gestures, performed daily, became sacred through their constancy. Lighting the fire, pouring the drink, breaking the bread, closing the shutters. These were prayers written not in words, but in action. The medieval tavern keeper would never have thought of herself as priestess or philosopher. And yet, in her patient tending of fire and fellowship, she embodied both. Each night she offered warmth to the cold. Each morning she gave silence to the tired. And in that endless circle, she found purpose. To live simply, to warm others, to endure quietly. That was her creed. The ghosts of the hearth, long after she is gone, long after the tavern itself has fallen into ruin, people will still say that on winter nights, when the wind sighs low through the valley, one can hear faint laughter and smell a trace of honey in the air. It is not haunting, but remembrance, the afterglow of centuries of comfort. For warmth once given does not vanish. It lingers in places where kindness once gathered. The stones remember. The wood remembers. The air remembers. And in that remembrance, something of humanity is preserved. The circle complete. The story of the night has no true ending. It flows quietly into the morning, and from morning back again into the next night. Like the turning of the seasons, like breath. The tavern's fire, though extinguished, will be lit again. The same cup will be filled. The same songs half sung, the same laughter quietly born. No era ends truly, only rests. The same hearts, though centuries apart, continue the same ritual of gathering against the cold. A final toast, if one could stand, now, among those long-gone people, in that small tavern on the edge of a sleeping village, and raise a cup before the fading fire. What words might they say? Not a speech, not a sermon. Only this: to warmth, to work, to peace, to the small light that keeps the dark kind, and they would drink, not for celebration, but for gratitude. Gratitude for the sweetness of honey, for the patience of fire, for the company of others. Closing reflections, the night fades. The story ends, but its warmth remains. For every time we sit in quiet company, for every drink poured in peace, for every silence shared without fear, we relight the same ancient fire. The taverns of the medieval world are gone, but their spirit burns wherever people gather softly against the dark. So as you lie in your bed, in the half-light of your own quiet room, imagine the faint glow of that old hearth, the scent of honey and wood smoke, the hush of the world at rest. You are part of the same lineage, a long chain of nights where warmth defied cold and companionship outlasted fear. Rest now, knowing that the cup is still full, the fire still lives, and the night, as always, will pass gently into dawn.